Heresy-era destroyer squads. Desperation leads to extremes, and across the battlefield the xenos now charge. Their slow spread advance killed so many of them that they made no progress against our bolters, always pushed back. But now they erupt into a final wail. A single scream is torn from their lungs as one, the death scream of a race, and they charge across the whole lines. Knowing so many will die, they forget all and do the unwanted. They begin to bunch, and the main thrust falters. Bolters are drowned out by the chain blades now running in their thousands behind us. But they are behind us. We are the spear tip, but one that has outpaced the leaf and the shaft. We see their line troopers break before us, as Sarge tears the head off two enemies, and then goes on to tear the guts out of another. He is in his element up close. We all are. He barks a grunt, and we finish ours off viscerally to intimidate. Then we form up and begin to fire, but we do so carefully. The Royal Guard. They have shields that stop bolters half of the time, so we head and knee shot them. It's going to get nasty if they hit us. But it's then that he, our sergeant, snaps another grunt. We break into two groups like the parting of a sea, fluidly and efficiently, always maintaining precision fire, even in the storm. And they are here. The destroyers are about to introduce themselves to the Royal Guard. We maintain our fire, gunning down as many of the flanking forces as possible, shooting out their legs, their heads, as the destroyers charge into them. The 10-man strong unit has so many ways to slaughter as we watch these maniacs go to work. The first few of the Royal Guard charge forward confidently, but their folly is realized swiftly. 4 blasts come out of the squad as it charges forward, lines of power that strike the shields of the xenos, but their metallic projections just seem to turn to dust as the beam then strikes their bodies, and in seconds it is like they simply disappear from the point that they are struck. Like a wave of unmaking, they are disintegrated. This unnerves many of them, but they still move forward. The destroyers now hit them in earnest. Power swords carve through shield, leg, spine, sinew. Power fists knock them back as one into lines of their allies, all crushed by the impact, blood exploding from them, leaving trenches of slickness below and around their flight path. Yet our bolters are not slaying enough of them. The sides are taking real pressure, and there are few of them. Ulik stabs his bolter into the air and tears into action his chain blade. We all follow suit. He does not even have to give the order, as we all charge. The destroyers are killing them so fast they are marching forward. We on their flanks, now ripping and tearing as we did before. The ground is awash with severed limbs, toppled giants, the flailing finished off by our chain blades attached to our bolters. And then it happens. The moment. Ulik had always trained us, always told us. Each little party had its high point, and this was it. The Royal Guard were being pushed back, but they had dragged the destroyers out of cohesion. Even with our support, the centre had gone, as a massive xenos with blackened armour tore into the front. It had not one, but 2 of these huge mallets that could crush a marine in one direct hit. It was a hero of some form. Then we saw it for what it was, their king. And Ulik filled the gap. The king swung down at him, and the sergeant just ducked and stepped back, the thing coming after him. But the king was livid, knowing this its last battle, and rose both hammers over its head to crush down on Ulic as one. Yet as they came down, Ulic spun on his heels and almost pirouetted, as he then swung a thunderous backhand strike on its leg in exactly the right spot. It broke backwards on itself, and the Xenos king fell forward. Ulic was on it in a flash, and it barely looked up at him as he brought down his chain blade, decapitating it messily. The remains of the royal guard all howled as one, and turned to flee. Ulic then strode to the severed head and beckoned over 4 unengaged men, now that the enemy had fled. He made them form a square, a support from their bolters, and rose him up as he stood on them. From his elevated position, Ulic held up the head of the dead king. The storm calming, the airs clearing, the sight of their king humbled. The panic went down the line. And as the Xenos broke, the other destroyer units across the entire battlefield went into them with a greater zeal. Charnabel blades sliced, chainswords ripped, rad grenades exploded amongst the Xenos. It became an utter slaughter, one that went on through the dawn and onwards. Only at the very end of the day did the destroyer squads return. The rest of the tactical units, such as ours, forming a perimeter around their last city, and gunning down any who made it out, attempting to flee. And they, the destroyers, they killed them all. In less than a day, they killed them all. Yet it was not the end of the events, for when we got topside again, well, story continued after the law. Welcome, gentle listener, I am Voldemort, your faithful servant, and I wish to introduce you to the forces, factions, and features of the 30K universe and the Horus Heresy, where the age of knowledge and enlightenment has ended, and the age of darkness has begun. And today, we shall be discussing one of the nastier elements of the Crusade, its armies, and the Legiones Astartes, the Space Marines. For it is often claimed that the Great Crusade had more advanced technology, seemed far more enlightened than the Imperium of the later setting, though, in many ways, the level of barbarity has not really altered at all. The reasons are just more plain, more simple, less nuanced. And today, we are to discuss the units that deftly illuminate my point. Of course, I can only be talking of the Legion Destoyer squads. Now they come in 2 particular flavors, differing equipment and loadouts, but effectively they perform a very similar role, and that job is simple: to utterly annihilate anything in front of them. Now we hear that so very often, that the use of a unit is to do X, and that X is usually the smashing of the foe. We are talking about a tabletop wargame after all, so the lore is always the reference and almost excuse for the battles that are played out. And as each and every single unit in the game is a martial one, then one can often feel slightly fatigued by the constant hyperbole. All of that said, the Destroyer unit is indeed a thing quite separate from those that exist in the 40th millennia or later. Now, to understand their origin, it is required that I readdress the perspective of the Crusade, the Emperor, and all of his forces. When the bloody and terrible Unification Wars had ended, the Emperor then took the most despicable of weaponry, the most horrific, and straight up banned the lot. Now there are always exceptions that prove the rule, and these exceptions are comically scattered across the setting quite thickly. Yet they are still the exceptions. They are not the standard arms of the Imperium, despite the faltering human empire knowing exactly how to construct them. Biochemical weapons, radiation discharge grenades, and even sidearms and worse. The use of all of them was virtually mandatory in the conquest of Terra, for near all sides used them, or fielded tanks, weaponry, and beings of terrifying power. But when it was done, when the last of the techno-barbarians had fallen after centuries of conflict, Terra was practically a wasteland. Water was limited, entire regions of the globe were irradiated and infected hellholes. Anyone living there was made pitiful by their surroundings, so all knew the terrible cost of using these devastating and permanently planetary scarring weapons of war. Other weapons were banned, as they caused too much of a threat, like the Dark Age of technology items and systems that augmented and weaponized psychers. Near all were relegated to the crypts of history, often under exceptionally heavy guard, only to be deployed in the direst need. Hence there were elite tiny groups forged by the Emperor for emergencies, like the Ordo Sinister. But most of the weaponry was radiation and chemically based, the kind and intensity that are only seen upon the execution of an exterminatus order. The big question for many would be, why? The Great Crusade was to assail the very stars, to take back every world previously claimed by humanity, and more, and to take revenge on the aliens, the xenos, who had brought us low. Some of the enemies of humanity would be as multitudinous as the very stars. Some would be horrors that made ancient myths of monsters and gods almost pale into insignificance. Surely the Imperium would do anything to win. Surely they were on a schedule and could waste nary a second. Why would they not deploy the most lethal weapons immediately? The answer is simple. Very simple indeed. If someone breaks into your house, you do not burn it down to eject them. Yes. Thus was the perspective of the Emperor, one he instilled into his entire army, navy, and auxiliaries, from the highest to the very lowest. For the goal was not to burn the galaxy, it was to claim it, to conquer it. What use is a planet if it has been irradiated? What use a planet that cannot support life? And each planet that the Crusade came across was not scouted and then mapped. It was identified and claimed. The Great Crusade did not set off to take back a slice of the stars, but all of them. And thus weapons that would destroy the ecosystem of a planet were only used sparingly and only in the very direst of need, when the cost of invasion would simply outweigh even an eternity of occupation, when a planet was not worth saving, and that which was on it had to be destroyed. So the Imperium usually controlled itself, made use of standard munitions, went in and slew the enemy in close quarters if need be. Yes, orbital bombardments were commonplace, but the use of exterminators was practically unheard of back then, or as far as I have read thus far at the least. But, and there is always a but, sometimes, just sometimes, the lords of the Crusade, be it the Emperor himself or via his Primarch sons, there was a need to break out these atrocities. It was only usually the Astartes who did this. Some weapons were used by the tech priests of Mars, of course, but most often it was the Astartes who would wield these censured weapons. And the units who did this were the Destroyer squads. Either the jump pack riding assault squads, or the ground-pounding Mortalis squads. The oddity of it was that these Marines, despite being placed in these squads of usually no fault of their own, were utterly shunned by most of their contemporaries in the legions. Not all, mind you. A few of the legions had their own units of specialists, and the Death Guard were known to field more than any other legion, and with zero calumny for those co-opted, Mortarion. What a charmer. Yet in the other legions, the placement in a destroyer squad was a death sentence. Or at the least, it was sending them to a special form of seclusion. For the weapons that these squads used could take a terrible toll on the wielders. For throwing a rad grenade may seem a huge lark to some, but this is Warhammer 30k, but still Warhammer. So it was not a simple flash of Star Trekian light and some toppling over. No. A rad grenade sends out a zone of radiation so intense it kills everything inside it practically immediately. Yet they are so potent that their effects could be carried on the winds or even come back towards the thrower. Similarly with the toxiferum weapons, flamer types that instead sent out gushes of contaminated putrescence. Nurgle was not the only one who would use toxic sludge to get his work done. And thus, the destroyer squads would often degenerate from the accidental side effects of bad weather, forcing it back at them. Or the slow and steady seep of radiation or infection would creep across their bodies and faces, showing how they would fall apart. Lesions and blemishes marring the usually perfect if rugged skin of the Astartes. Even phosphex was used, held by a sergeant, unleashed when he felt it required. These squads would be armed with not only vile weapons like these, but also some of the best weaponry to support it. Thunderhammers, Chernobyl blades, plasma weapons, melter bombs, the usual works. But also, these were some of the very few squads or units of any type whatsoever that were permitted to use disintegrator guns. Yes, you heard that right. Disintegrator guns. The utter bane of all life, the disintegrator weapon did exactly what it said in the title. They ripped things apart on the molecular level, sundering the covalent bonds and making things simply fall apart into nothingness. And that was a threat to anyone, even a Primarch. So they were very strictly controlled. 2 legions had specialist units for their destroyers. The Great Khan, ever a pragmatist, had his own units. But I find it the Sons of the Angel with the most interesting history to their use. The Angel Sanguinius, Primarch of the 9th Legion, the one most akin to the Emperor in so many ways. He brought a nobility to his legion that saved their very souls. But when he had offered mercy and integration, if it were refused by a recalcitrant world, he was known to bring the wrath of humanity down on that planet. And he was not shy about using the most heinous weapons to make it happen. He was no butcher. He was possibly the greatest Primarch. But he had his father's cold dispassion in him when he wished, when forced. And Sanguinius had his angel's tears, each marine titled an Erelim, an archaic name for an order of warrior angels. The Erelim were his assault destroyers. But the thing that is most intriguing is how he protected the honor and names of those he sequestered to this terrible task. It is also that he would not field them unless at his personal direction, but this may be exaggeration. In any case, the Erelim were not seen as a punishment. The Marine would be hidden behind his mask and never reveal himself. His name would never be entered into any rolls, and his service record would be sterling. While he served, he would take a ritual name, a title to hide behind perhaps, or a mask to wear to avoid the repercussions of the actions taken, almost like an Eldar aspect warrior. And when, or if, the Marine had served his time, Sanguinius would then return him to the ranks and permit him to reintegrate. Not a single blemish on his name, for much of the inner circle was nameless like this, so it would not be obvious at all if the sequestered Marine had served as an heirloom, one of the Angels' Tier squad, or if they had served amongst the specialist and exalted ranks of even the bodyguard of the Primarch. Thus they were shielded by him. But one could argue, thus were they able to release their true wrath unfettered by even passing vestiges of guilt. For when they joined the Angels' Tiers, their only goal was abject slaughter. An interesting take on a unit that most legions had available to them. Yet, as stated, due to the codification of these practices so considerately, one wonders if Mortarion was actually the most prolific of these destroyer units. Food for thought, perhaps, as not everything is said. I always feel, right or not, that half of the fun of the setting is a deep dive, even if you come up in the wrong pool. 'Tis fun. Now, I do not have the exact reason that the destroyer units were not used in the centuries and millennia after the heresy, but one can make an educated guess or two. Clearly, these squads are not in the Codex Astartes, and that's just the start. Everything I have read of Reboot Gilliman states he would have absolutely abhorred the deployment of these heinous formations. Hence, it is intensely unlikely he would have valued them enough to codify them. He would also have tried to do things another way, a less wasteful or wrathful way. Do not get me wrong, the Avenging Sun is a veritable cardinal of kick-ass, but he never really had the wrath that the more formidable Primarchs had. Secondly, the nature of the conflict, and thus the very reason for the deployment of the Astartes, the Space Marines, had altered. They were no longer a huge army bent on conquest and the domination of all the galaxy. Those dreams had died. And when the Primarchs returned from the scouring, they had shattered legions of their own. In my estimation, Reboot lost his bottle. He was crushed under the weight of the reports, deployments, containments, encounters, logistics, and need. He did not think like his other brothers. He was always empire building. And some believe this makes him perfect to leave in charge. But he also was too involved. And when a leader tries to do everything, they end up doing nothing. And as I see things at the moment, and I suspect that Reboot kind of lost it a bit. Crushed under the weight of responsibility, unable to ignore huge swathes of data that others of his brothers would have compartmentalized and, in truth, deputed to others. But why do I say this? Because the entire goal changed. Reboot saw threats everywhere. Dwindling resources, shattered armies and weak frontiers, and he organized the Imperium to hold, to change the Marines from an aggressive force to a localized reaction formation. And thus, in his heart, if not his head, he organized the Astartes so they could not destroy things in their march to defeat the enemy. So it would have been imperative to eradicate and limit these weapons further, for he envisioned all of the battle being on home turf, defensive. Seems utterly logical now, especially when he had so damn few resources to use to cover such a large span. But, in so doing, in my mind, he gutted the legions, not just in size. He took the fire out of the Marines, because they were born and bred to conquer, and now they would be forced to fight like Ultramarines, defensively. And the break of the legions unto itself near created a civil war. But was it just the breaking down of the legions? Or did the other Primarchs see writ large that Reboot had indeed lost his bottle and his sanity? For any empire only exists while it is expanding. Like sharks, if they stagnate, if they stand still, they die. And they, his brother Primarchs, all knew it, could read it in his tome. his codex Astartes. Perhaps. I'm sure rebuttals will be plentiful, but let us keep them polite. It's a game after all. But again, hit the comments. Tell me what you think. Did Reboot lose his spine? Yet all of this is interesting bump compared to the most important reason of all, for the cancellation of the Destroyer units. The one irrefutable fact that I believe most contributed to the removal of the Destroyer squads from the armies of mankind. And it's simple again. They could not support the tech anymore. Disintegrators, rad grenades, phosphex and toxiferin flamers. The Imperium could not devote their many resources to create specialist weaponry anymore. They had more important things to make, like armor, bolters, storm raven ships and chainsaws. The Heresy saw the destruction of so much equipment, let alone the scouring afterwards, worsening the needs. Removing so much of the arsenal of the Imperium, old weapons would not be returned to them. When they were gone, they were gone. But it also meant that there were far fewer Forge Worlds remaining as well. So much had been burnt in the conflagration of the Heresy. So they had to rebuild as best they could, and these high-end weapons, requiring intense skill to maintain and service, they were simply not worth the effort. Not when a bolter could get the job done, and was actually preferred by the chapter marines. The Volkite weapons even. They all slowly disappeared from service. Then eventually, the ability to create them, not used for so long, a data corruption here, an STC template eroding there, and soon enough, the Imperium had lost the ability to make them at all. Well, on any scale that would be usable at the least. But to all extents and purposes, with the new regime, the new goal, the new defensive perspective, and the degeneration in ability to even field these weapons, the Codex Astartes ended the page on the Destroyer unit. Hence, my advice is thus: play Horus Heresy and have a go with these units, because they are now firmly a thing of the past. I have been Voldemort, your faithful servant. Sling us a like if you did, a subscribe if you wish to hear more, and links are in the description. Thank you for your precious time. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo, and back to the story. We had arrived back on the ship. As always, we had been delayed, practically the last to leave. But this time, it was for a reason. When the doors to the shuttle opened, we were accosted by the sight of a hangar that was utterly packed. Line upon line of our chapter were there, perhaps most of them. And as we left the transport, we could all see him, surrounded by his honored guard. Our lord, our master. He was the Pale King, Mortarion. Ulluk took off his helm, raised his chin, and walked straight toward him, utterly overconfident, we thought. Helmeted still as we were, it was unmistakable that we were all glancing at each other as we followed him in perfect lockstep. Ulluk, the bastard. He walked straight toward the king and put out his hand. All on the deck held their breath. But without so much as a flicker of his eyelids, Mortarion nodded to his aide to bring them forward. Aghast, in utter shock, the Primarch himself handed the bubbling, murky black drink to Ulluk. The glass was exquisite, of course. The draughts of death. And as the Pale King slung back his brew, to his surprise, so did Ulluk. Their arms both coming down from their faces, Ulik's arm then went out to the aid again. His eyes locked on Mortarian's. He seemed to be trying to stare him out. And then he just spat. "Tastes like more." The death shroud seemed to lurch a pace forward. A blade was even near drawn, many hands on hilts as they eyed Ulik. The Pale King, our Lord and Master, just nodded, holding Ulik's gaze. He nodded, extending his own glass without looking, and both were refilled. And both Ulik and Mortarian raised a glass, and drank again deeply. Ulik seemed to sway for a mere millisecond as he lowered his glass from his lips. But then, to the intake of breath from all, he shot his arm out again. His voice was low, rasping, weak, but he spat again. "More." At this, the Primarch took one step closer to Ulik, towering over him. Yet he did not break his locked eyes. He did not smirk, nor nod, nor raise an eyebrow even. He just moved out his arm, and both glasses were filled again. He should have been dead from 2, 1 even. But 2 of these lethal brews? It was his way. For the victor on the field to be honoured with a concoction of poison so lethal that they would even affect the stamina of a Primarch eventually. Yet here was the third. Surely a mere marine, even one such as Ulik, should be dead. The third draught was poured. But before they drank, the Primarch leant down, practically to the nose of Ulik, and he whispered, "You are near death, Ulik. Vanity?" And our sergeant, he whispered back, "Nay." The king spoke to him again. "Who is your lord?" Ulik now drank. He bolted back the drink, the glass dropping from his hand as his left arm just fell. He could barely stand even now, even before the third draught had taken hold of him. And he said, "You are." And only few could hear as the Primarch truly whispered, "Not the Crusade, humanity, or even their Emperor." Ulik craned his head and looked at him even deeper. "No, I care not for any of that. You are my lord. So bloody use me." And the Pale King rose. His mouth contained a wry twist at the corners, as close to a smile as any of us had ever witnessed. He now spoke loudly enough for every last person in the hangar to hear. "Oh, rest assured, Ulik, I shall use you." He spoke over his shoulder, still eyeballing the smaller man. "Take this, my warrior, to the apothecary." To which the sergeant, damn him, barely even able to stand, he shook his head slowly, then turned and started to walk. His back turned on the Primarch. Again the hackles of the Death Shroud seemed up, yet the Pale King raised a hand to stop them, and stated, "Let him walk, if he can. And if he wakes, then he shall arise a centurion. And if you wake, I will use you, Ulik. I will use you." As his squad, we followed him in lockstep again, and as soon as he made it out of the hangar, the very next step, he fell. We caught him before he hit the deck, and we put him on our shoulders as we walked him to the apothecary. And there we stayed, all of us. Days passed. It was touch and go. But he made it. And he took us with him. He was risen to centurion, and we were to be his guard, all of us. And from there, well, that is a long tale indeed. a story stretching millennia. To be continued.